Hi, this is Music Theory in One Lesson. By the end of this video, you should expect to know how to derive a scale, build some chords based off of that scale, and play in a key. Music theory is not as daunting as most people make it out to be. In fact, one of the hardest parts about music theory and learning music theory is the fact that most people require that you learn to read music first, and that can cause a little bit of confusion. With this video and the book that will be coming out, which will take these ideas even farther, so I recommend you check out my link below. With this video, I'm going to turn the tables. We're going to learn music theory first, and then you can take that and learn to read music actually much easier. So the first thing we need to talk about is just a simple note. What is a note? It kind of helps to really define this before you jump in, because of course everybody understands what a note is, but let's look at it in a really literal kind of fashion. A note is a wave in the air. So if I play this note on my guitar, my amp is causing the air in the room to move at a certain rate. That's really all a note is. We represent notes on paper using letters, but those letters really represent a number, which is how fast the wave oscillates. Now, we won't get into specific numbers because it's really much easier to use letters, but the note will represent that rate of oscillation. I'm going to play the same note on two different strings. As you can hear, it sounds like one note. Here's one note. Here's the note twice on two different strings. The reason it sounds like one note is because both notes are oscillating at exactly the same rate. And when they do that, the lines line up very, very nicely in the air. But if I take one of those notes and move it, we get something different. We get an awful sound there. And I moved the note slightly. If you listen between the notes, you'll hear a wobble. That wobble is quite simply the two waves clashing into each other. So if I give those notes a little more space, they might clash a little more regularly. A little bit more space. More space yet. And more space yet. So as one note moves farther away from the first, we get different effects based off of how much space they have between each other. And by space, I mean the physical distance I have to cover over the fretboard. A pianist has to cover physical distance. It's a little bit harder to think about space when it comes to horns and things like that, but it's quite simple to think about on the guitar neck or the piano's keyboard. So think about space. And on the paper here, we're going to have space as well. Space is one of the most important things to understand in music. What happens if I go the other way? What if I take one of those notes and I bring it up in pitch? So I have two notes. These are the same note again. And I'm going to use a scale to go up. So it's not going to be every single note on the way up. But we're going to move one of those notes upwards. A little bit of a different sound. Different yet. Different yet. That last one gives me the same kind of effect as when I play the other two notes. You hear how, and actually I ought to tune my guitar before I do these videos. It's a very hollow sound. They almost sound like the exact same note. Well, that's because eventually, as I brought one note up, it started to ring twice as fast, exactly twice as fast as the first. That's called the octave, and it's very, very important to understand the octave before we get to specific letters. The octave essentially is where your alphabet begins to repeat. The musical alphabet starts on the letter A, and it goes up to the letter G and repeats into infinity, basically, outside of our range of hearing even, and you could probably compose music that people couldn't even hear. I don't know what the point of that would be, but I'm sure there's somebody out there interested in doing it. We limit our alphabet to our range of hearing. Now, if we think about this repeating alphabet, we should think about it in terms of space. As it moves out in either direction, we get space. And the space is really just the change in frequency. We conceptualize it as space on paper, and in the air, it's actually change in frequency. So let's talk about what's called our chromatic scale. Our chromatic scale is built off of the smallest amount of space that we have available in Western music, which is called the half step. Now, I told you the musical alphabet goes A to G, but there are other notes in between it. And if you've ever seen any popular art involving music, you've probably seen sharps and flats. So we get sharps and flats in between certain notes, but not all of them. So let's examine. We have A here, A sharp, which is a half step up, B, which is another half step, C, a half step up from B, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, and G sharp. Those are all of my notes using sharps. We'll go into flats after this. Now, it's important to note that one note from the next is a half step. Same with every fret on the guitar. We have half steps all the way up and down. And one key to the next on the piano is a half step. So these things are very easy to identify and find on your instrument once you have this map. But we don't use the chromatic scale so much to write music. We use other patterns. The first pattern, and in fact the only pattern I'm going to use for this video, you can download this worksheet on my website and use the minor pattern too. It works exactly the same way as the major pattern but gives you different feels. We're going to use the major pattern to write something today. Specifically, we're going to use the D major pattern. Now, other scales are not built off of just the half step. It's built off of a series of whole and half steps. So to build the major pattern, the first thing I do is circle my root note. Root notes are incredibly important in music theory because, remember, we talked about how notes interacted with each other. Everything is a ratio in music. So if I play these two notes that I played before, the same note on two different strings, I can do that as well with a different note. And I get the same effect, but it's at a different pitch. That's how all intervals work. So if I take an interval like this, an interval just means space, and I move it up still, I get the same effect, but at a different pitch. So here is my root note, D. The major pattern goes whole step, half step, whole, 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 half. And if we do it correctly, we should land on the note we started. So a whole step up from D is E. There's my first whole step. Another whole step up from there is F sharp. Another half step is G. Now a whole step up from this G, if you go G sharp, keep in mind that we repeat, so really we can go to A here. A. Another whole step to B. Whole step to C sharp. And then a half step lands us back on our root note, the D. This is a scale. If I were to play this scale, we go D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. That's what a major scale sounds like. But what good does a scale do us? Well, it does a lot of good. We can write melodies with it, and we can also build chords with it. In this video, I'm only going to stick to one key, which means using one scale to build all my chords. A lot of music, most of music, uses more than one key at once, and in my book I explain how that works. But for the sake of simplicity in this video, we're going to stick with D major for now. Now, in order to build our chords, we're going to have to write our scale here in what I call my harmonic map. Now notice I gave myself a little more than just one octave of the scale, and you'll see why here in a moment. So I'm going to write out my scale 4 times in this grid. I suggest you do this at home with as many different major scales as you can. So take the notes that you circled up above and fill them in to this grid. Sorry, this takes just a moment for me to write down. You guys are getting the same experience as my students that come into the studio for lessons. There we have it. The D major scale written out 4 times. In order to get a chord out of this scale, I have to pick some more, you guessed it, root notes. So I'm going to pick my first root note as the D. It makes sense in the key of D to pick my root note as D. I'm going to write a Roman numeral here to the left, 1. Notice that it corresponds with this one up here. And in order to get a chord, it's very, very simple. All I have to do is take every other note until I have 3. This is the most basic chord in music. It's called the triad. Well, that's my 1 chord. Let's take a look at a 2 chord. Take a moment to guess what my root note might be. It's an E, because up here, what are called my scale degrees, the root note of this Roman numeral corresponds with the scale degree. Notice that it is lowercase. That means it is minor. My book will explain what the difference between major and minor chords are and why they happen, but for the sake of this video, just know that it's minor. And I'm going to take every other note until I have 3 for my triad there. Next, I'm going to do a 4 chord and then a 5 chord after that. Take a moment to guess where your root notes are. For my 4 chord, it's a G, because that's the 4 there of the scale. I'm going to take every other note until I have 3. My 5 chord starts on the A. Now we have all of the notes that make up our chords. Let's talk about what a chord is real quick. So this first chord, D major, a lot of guitarists know the D major chord, right there. And if you were to say, well, what notes are those? Why is this a D major chord? Well, we have D, A, D, F sharp. All D, F sharp, and A, if you look at our harmonic map. And a piano, if the piano were to play as many notes as they would like, but as long as those notes were D, F sharp, and A, they would be playing a D major chord. The same with E minor. A lot of people know this on the guitar. It's a very common guitar chord and common chord in general. I'm playing E, B, E, G, B, E. All E's, G's, and B's. And if you look at the diagram, we have those three notes. So that's what a chord is on a guitar and a piano. But you can take this concept even further. You can say, well, there are melodies in there, and I can play those melodies over top of each other using whatever instruments I choose to create a bigger chord. So if you're in a band and you have a guitarist and a bassist, the guitarist can take the F sharp and the A, and the bassist can take the D, and you are together playing a D major chord. I'm going to demonstrate this using my looper pedal. A looper will basically record me and play me back. Now, it's going to be done one line at a time. I'm going to draw a line through my first melody. Here. It goes D, E, G, and A. So we have D, E, G, A. I'm going to play each note 4 times just so that the melody can kind of sink in. So we're going to go. Now I've told my looper to play myself back here. The next melody goes F sharp, G, B, and C sharp. I'm going to take that melody and play it over the first melody here. Let's take the third melody and see what that one does. Now we have a chord progression. Now, as you can imagine, you can have a violin play one note, a clarinet the next, and someone could sing the other. Really, your imagination is the only limit here. Let's try something similar. Let's do the same thing in F major. I'm going to erase what we've done so far. I want you to see that music is movable. It's all about your root note, and then what you play after that is dependent on what note you pick as your root. Now, keep in mind, I'm not presenting these as rules, and you can actually build chords with other notes, and my book goes into more types of chords, and you can also make up your own chords using these notes. This is more something for you to play with as a musician. Because in today's world, there is really no such thing as a hard and fast rule for music. You can go to the academic institutions, and that becomes very apparent. You can also go to any concert, and at least one musician is going to be doing something that another might consider to be strange. So I'm going to derive this F major scale using first the chromatic scale that has sharps, just to show you a problem that might jump up in your practice. Here's my root note, the F. A whole step to G, whole step to A, half step to A sharp, a whole step to C, another whole step to D, whole step to E, and a half step lands me back on F. But something curious happens. We have F, G, A sharp, C, D, E, F. Well, this is why we have sharps as well as flats. If I take the same pattern, now I have my B. Whereas before, A sharp, C, that's kind of weird. But A, B flat, C, now we have our entire alphabet. Let's go down here. So here's my F major scale. I'm going to leave out this side of the grid for this part of the exercise because I want you to kind of get an idea for what an inversion is. We're not going to go deep into it. My book explains it very, very thoroughly. But I'd like you to kind of get an idea as far as what it is. We're going to take the same progression that we did as well in the last, using the last scale, which is 1, 2, 4, 5. A very, very, very common progression. All right, so 1, 2, 4, and 5. F, G, B flat, C. I'm going to take every other note. Notice here at the 5, I've run out of room. Well, I'm going to take that G, move it down here. Now we have a bit of a different, more interesting set of melodies we can play to make these chords. Take a look at that. Now there's a little more of a contour to it. Let's take a look what this sounds like. So my first melody, F, G, B flat, G. Then the next melody, A, B flat, D, and C. Then our next melody, C, D, F, E. We have a progression that has the very same feel as our last one, but it's at a different pitch. Feel free to download this little worksheet here and work off of it as much as you like.